As we record this, America
Mhm.
is coming into the third month of COVID-19 pandemic. Many of us have been quarantined at home all this time, connecting with others only through screens, while the unemployment rate climbs up into the range of maybe even 20%. At the same time, we're now into the 11th day of protests spurred by the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police and the widespread acknowledgement that the damage that racism has made on our society. Nerves are frayed and energy is high. From a psychological perspective, you might say that many of us are being triggered by events and living in a state of fight or flight. This makes it a particularly appropriate topic for us to talk about with our guest today, Dr. Julie Holland. She's the author of several books, including the bestseller Moody Bitches, and is the editor of The Pot Book and Ecstasy, the Complete Guide. Her new book, just being released, is Good Chemistry, the Science of Connection from Soul to Psychedelics. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, human connection. Why is connection so important?
Yeah, connection. Remember that? Remember when we used to connect? So what I talk about in Good Chemistry is that we are sort of programmed or hardwired to be social. Our species is categorized as obligatorily gregarious, which means we are obligated to be friendly and affable and get along and cooperate. And we're designed to get pleasure from connecting and cooperating, because without it, our species dies out. So in Good Chemistry, I try to explain how connection puts the body into a different mode from fight or flight. You know, when we're stressed out, or, you know, I think a good example is, like, let's say your kitchen's on fire, right? Like, you're just going to focus on the fire or getting out of the kitchen. It's not a time to pick up the phone and see who's calling. You know, you're not going to be social. You've got work to do. So when we are in fight or flight, our bodies are really designed to focus on either attacking, running away, and it's not focused at that time on being social. But we need to be social in order to survive, right? We need to mate, we need to bond with our babies, we need to be altruistic and empathetic, or we're not gonna make it. So we get pleasure from these states of connection, and these states of connection pull us out of fight or flight and put us into the other side of survival, which is called the parasympathetic nervous system. So fight or flight is sympathetic, and parasympathetic is when you rest and digest. And very importantly, it's when your body can repair itself. The only time your body runs any of these repair mechanisms, really, is when you are in this rest and digest and repair state, which is called the parasympathetic state.
So in the book, you describe how loneliness actually affects us not only emotionally, but physically. That it has a physical aspect to it, which actually is very damaging to human health.
Right. So chronic loneliness puts us in fight or flight. When we are socially isolated, we are in fight or flight. If we are worried about being ostracized, we are in fight or flight. So loneliness is really bad for your body, and social isolation does quite a few things. It deranges our metabolism, right? It makes us fat. It deranges our sleep-wake cycles, and we get insomnia. And also, it creates problems where we can't learn adequately. And this is something I focus on a lot in Good Chemistry, because people don't understand this or know it. But social isolation interferes with the molecular process of learning. So, like, if you take an animal that is housed in social settings, you can pull them out and shock them and put them back with their friends. And if you put them in the shocking room again, they remember they were shocked there and they're not very happy about it. But if they're socially isolated and they're alone, and you shock them and you put them back somewhere alone, and then you put them back in the shocking room, they don't remember that that was the room where they got shocked. So social isolation makes us fat, makes us stupid. We don't sleep very well. We're cranky, but it can make us depressed. It can make us anxious. You know, there's a combination of psychological and physiological effects, and they're all bad.
This is one of the things about the book that I found so inspiring and really interesting in a number of ways, that there is a social good to people being in connection with each other, emotionally connected and physically healthy. That when you're in a place where you're not in para, as you describe it in the book, you call it the parasympathetic
Yeah.
space or state is, you know, you call it para, which I think is really charming.
Oh, good. I was really trying to come up with some, I call it para, but I was trying to give it some like cuter kind of moniker, and Brene Brown refers to it as tend and befriend, which is really smart and does it quite a lot of good. And sometimes I'll say connect and protect. So in para, we have the ability to connect. And when we connect, it puts us in para. So it's a lot of cycles, right? And this is something I talk about in Good Chemistry is, we have this sense that like our hormones affect our behavior, but really things happen in our environment that trigger our hormones. For instance, if I put testosterone on my skin, it might make me horny, right? But the other thing that would make me horny is if I saw a guy that I thought was attractive. That creates testosterone in my body. So I don't know why I happen to give that example. So stimulus in the environment triggers hormone in the body triggers behavior, but a lot of times really what it's doing is it's just accelerating a loop that's happening, right? So oxytocin allows me to nurse my baby. My baby latches onto my breast and I look at the baby latching and I feel tremendous love. And so there's oxytocin coming because I'm nursing, but there's also oxytocin being generated because I've got this eye contact with the baby, and it solidifies a loop.
So the way that it's interesting to me that at this point in the development of psychology and all that we understand about human well-being, that you were inventing the term for how we should be in a normal state, in a healthy normal state.
That para is supposed to be the default state. Right. And the thing that's so frustrating is nobody knows about it. What I say in Good Chemistry is like from middle school to medical school, I must have been taught about fight or flight and the sympathetic nervous system a dozen times easily. And every time it's sort of sold to me as like, this is the key to survival, this is survival of the fittest. And this is, if you can't do fight or flight, you're not going to survive. And that may be true. But there's this whole flip side to survival that is equally true and perhaps more true, which is that there's plenty of times where fighting or running away is not going to help you out. For instance, in relationship, right? I mean, there's a chapter in this book on having, the way the book is set up is that there's connection with the self, where you're embodied and you feel sort of like you have integrity and all the facets of yourself are on the same page, right? That's connection with the self. Then chapter 2 is about connecting with a partner. Chapter 3 is about connecting with a family. Then chapter 4 is connecting with society, then with nature and death and the cosmos. So there's these things that get bigger and bigger as we go. But the thing about being in partnership is that you can't fight or run away. If you want a successful partnership, you have to stay and learn and grow and connect and protect each other. And trust that that person is going to take care of you. And all those things require oxytocin. All those things require you to be in the parasympathetic state. So being in para helps you form relationships. Being in relationship helps to keep you in para. Obviously, we're not always in para all the time. Relationships are very challenging. They sometimes put us in fight or flight. We yell, we run away, but a successful relationship, you have to come back, you have to stay and sort of work through your issues. And it's easier to work through those issues if you are in para. So, this idea of like a teachable moment, with kids where like if they're in the middle of a tantrum, you can't sort of explain what the rules are, remind them of how things are supposed to be. They can't hear you. So when we fight in relationship, there are times when we are in sympathetic and it's not a good time to really have a heart to heart, because people aren't open to it. So what's happening now, speaking of openness, with the demonstrations or things like that, if both sides are yelling, neither side is really going to be open to learning or changing. And, but what I love about kneeling is it does really put you in para. The people who are kneeling at the protests, they're not fighting, they're not running away, they're staying. And they're trying to stay calm. And it's a little bit of a subordinate posturing, kneeling. But if everyone's kneeling, everyone's subordinating, no one's fighting, no one's running away. And in theory, you could be more in para than you were if you're chanting and yelling. And I'm obviously there's a time for calling attention to a problem and you need to chant and yell and get people's attention. But when it comes to actually integrating what we're learning and changing the laws and sitting down and working out the nuts and bolts of how we want police to act and how we want protesters to be and how we want our government to be, we are going to need to be in para to cooperate and have those discussions and to learn and grow and change.
Well, what you realize is that we need to be in para in order to have a democracy.
We do. Our country needs to be in para,
The
right?
country needs to be in para in the sense
right.
that when you commit to a partnership, it's important to be in para in order to maintain the intimacy and to trust the connection and hold the connection.
Right.
As long as we're, as a country, working through complicated issues that can trigger fight or flight, left and right, our ability to step back from that state in order to see the other, to see the one that we're arguing with, to see the one that we're demonizing as having a legitimate perspective that we need to take into account and listen to and understand in a human-to-human way, requires our having the social skills, or perhaps it's the psychological tools that can move us into a place of openness for that kind of connection.
Right. So I talk in Good Chemistry quite a bit about, or I write in Good Chemistry quite a bit about this idea of openness, right? Catherine McLean, when she was at Hopkins, did this great research showing that these psychedelic experiences that people were having at Hopkins, when you measured some personality traits before the psilocybin experience and after, there was a significant increase in the measurement of openness. So openness to new experiences, openness to new ideas, right, to new information. And so you could make a case that psychedelics can help us sort of bridge the gap, that's happening with the polarization in the country. But, the other thing that I write about in chapter 4, which is a society chapter, is that sort of there is this flip side to oxytocin, right? As much as we think of it as this hormone of trust and bonding, biologically, the times that we're really high oxytocin states are like if we're nursing or childbirth or orgasm, and they're the like intense experiences of bonding and connection and trust. But the other time that our oxytocin levels sort of go up is when we are deciding who's in our tribe and who's not in our tribe, and are you an us or are you a them? And social cohesion is really facilitated and enabled by oxytocin. So that gets into this whole issue of our country being divided and being polarized, but like each side sort of feels good that they're on the side they're on because they have that social cohesion. So being together, all agreeing on something, there's something very heady. I mean, I imagine you've been to, perhaps raves or Burning Man or some other, concerts or gatherings where you feel like you're with a lot of like-minded people, or maybe a political rally, for instance. And that is a heady, incredibly pleasurable experience to be with people who agree with you, who think like you do, and everybody's sort of chanting the same thing. There's a pleasurable feeling to that. And what I didn't write in the book, or what I wrote and then maybe got deleted, is like, I hope this explains Trump rallies to you a little bit. Or maybe I did leave it in the book, but I took it out of an article I wrote recently. I don't want to be inflammatory or incendiary. And, one of the potential titles for this book was actually These United States, because I wanted to talk about states of oneness, and how good they are for our bodies and for our minds, and how if America or United States could actually come together and be united, it would be good for all of our sort of physiologies. It's good for the whole country. It's good for each person in the country to feel like they belong to one thing and that everybody is cooperating and on the same page. And obviously right now is just an extreme example of how divided and polarized we feel.
There really is a heightened sense of tribalism right now.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, as you mentioned, as you just mentioned, connection and oxytocin can be a way of, in fact, increasing that polarization potentially, right? But we know that there are tools that allow for an overcoming of those sort of tribal impulses that allow us to understand how to hold ourselves in a place of openness. Do you see a way of, how would the work that you've been doing suggest that kind of healing and reconciliation in the country, in a broader,
Well, a few things come up.
personal relationships?
You know, I have a few ideas about this. I mean, one is that the United States has like deep childhood wounding, basically. You know, the way that every person has childhood trauma that ends up affecting their behavior. Our country has early childhood wounding and trauma that affects our behavior, right? I mean, first of all, we had the genocide of the native peoples. And then we had slavery, and we had a lot of exploitation of immigrants for a long time. That's really what the country was built on to some degree. And I just saw something on Twitter about how, you know, good thing we're not, the country's not, you know, founded on ancient, you know, Indian burial grounds, haha. And it's like, it is, we are, you know, and until America really cops to the trauma and the terrible atrocities that it committed or were committed in the name of, you know, forming our country, it's going to be this kind of, you know, the trauma that dictates behavior. If it's not addressed, if it's not debriefed and understood and integrated, it's going to wreak havoc. So how does America process its childhood trauma? I mean, you know, do I like prescribe psychedelics for America? I mean, like, we can't do that. But, you know, the way that people learn new behavior and transmit learned behavior to other people, and it sort of comes down generation to generation, I do think that the people who are doing work on themselves, who understand this idea of digging up childhood trauma and integrating it, they can at least lead by example and model healthy behavior and talk about things like childhood trauma and integration. So just more and more people kind of get the idea. One of the interesting things that I learned about I saw some research that showed that people who take psychedelics, not only are they less likely to engage in intimate partner violence, but they're also more likely to be environmental activists and sort of eco-conscious. So it's this idea that, you know, when people have altered states or when they're tripping and they're peaking, a lot of people have this sense that everything is connected. That, you know, this idea that we are separate is really an illusion. And the truth is that we are all connected by the same sort of, you know, universal lattice work of energy or of love or whatever you want to call it. But people who have mystical experiences will experience. Perhaps they experience a void where there's nothing, but then they experience this tremendous light where there's sort of everything and everything is connected. It's a really blissful state. And if you come away from a psychedelic experience feeling like everything is connected and I am part of nature and, you know, we are all just floating around on this spherical clod of dirt in space, you know, like, if you pull back and get a big picture, you see how we're really all one and we're all together and we're all in this together. And that kind of thinking, we're all in this together, you know, that to me is a basis of a democracy. And this idea of like, you know, I got mine, you go get yours, you know, which is very selfish and self-centered, and I'm not going to take care of you, you take care of you, I'm taking care of myself. That to me is more of like a capitalist way of doing things. And I think that our society is seeing that, you know, unrestricted growth and capitalism really is like a cancer. You know, unrestricted growth in medicine is just called cancer. That's what it is. So when you have unrestricted growth in capitalism, it does sort of metastasize and ruin a lot of things for a lot of people. And if we can remember the lessons of psychedelics, which is that we are all here equally and we are all connected and we are all interdependent, and what I do affects you. And, you know, me getting mine, if that stops you from getting yours, that's a problem. And if there's enough for everybody, how do we share? You know, these are lessons of psychedelics and lessons of MDMA. And I would even say lessons from cannabis, that other people in the country, you know, it would be good if they could learn these lessons.
You mentioned that people who have done psychedelics have are less likely to, say, do, you know, acts of spousal abuse, more likely to be activists. I'm wondering if there's another correlation you could make between people who are developing the skills to be in healthy partnership and also then being able to participate in a healthy way in a collaborative environment that includes democratic decision making.
Well, I
That
definitely,
when we
I think
do
that makes sense.
yeah, that if we do our own work on ourselves,
Right.
what it does is prepare us for the social, for the community work.
Right. I
And the flip
definitely agree
side
with that.
being, I'm curious to hear you talk about this for a moment, but the flip side being, if you don't do that work, if you don't understand how to hold an intimate relationship in a healthy place over time, if you don't address your wounds and do your own personal healing, that you're then in a less advantageous place to participate in the societal healing that needs to happen.
Yeah. Well, I absolutely agree with that. I've been trying to write an article actually about sort of along the lines of like, what if Donald Trump, took a weekend and maybe had some ayahuasca experiences, and what would that look like, and would that be helpful, and is it possible that if he processed his own childhood traumas and how he's acting them out, that maybe he wouldn't inflict his traumas on everyone else. So that's been sort of fun to toy with that idea. But I do think that, there is a place for people doing work on themselves, learning how to sit with very challenging feelings, learning how to integrate challenging experiences or a history of trauma and sort of make sense of it, make a place for it, have some sort of acceptance or equanimity around it. People who are less traumatized overall are going to inflict less trauma. So the more people who can sort of do work on themselves and unearth their own traumas and get a sense of what's driving their behavior, the better for everybody. And that's not quite the same as me saying, turn on, tune in, drop out. I would probably preface it by saying that the studies and the research that we've been doing, that MAPS is doing, that Hefter is doing, that USONA or Compass are doing, like these studies with psychedelics or with MDMA, the people who are, first of all, the people who are running the studies are all like highly credentialed, and the subjects who are going through the studies are very highly screened, and then supported, educated, prepared for what the psychedelic experience is going to look like. And then there's a lot of appointments and sessions after the psychedelic experience to help process it and integrate it. Optimally, if people are going to avail themselves of these therapeutic tools, they're going to do so in a way that really enhances their set and their setting so that they are properly educated and properly prepared, supervised during the experience, and then after, this whole period of integration. We talk a lot about integration in the psychedelic community or in psychiatry. And the metaphor that I will sort of explain to patients is like, if you take a huge bite of a sandwich, then you have to sit back and chew it for a while and swallow it and wash it down with some water, and it gets digested, and then your body can, make use of the minerals. And so it's, the psychedelic experience is like you got a sandwich in your mouth, and now you have to do the work of really like, what did I figure out? What did I learn? How can I apply this to my daily living? And how can I, walk the talk?
I want to go in two different ways here, two different questions here. So I'm gonna tee them up one after the other.
Okay.
In the wake of the pandemic, and now I think this, clearly new wave of traumatic experience that the protests are bringing on for people in all kinds of different ways. You feel like the country is entering a place where there's going to be so many people traumatized by this whole period. Right. And, an ongoing challenge around the economics coming up as well. There have been some psychiatrists who've been saying that the use of psychedelics at this time should be become much more widespread in the therapeutic context. That the government should look at this as a crisis that needs to be addressed with the tools that psychedelic therapists have been developing, which are now being shown to be so effective in clinical trials, and also clearly anecdotally. How do you feel about that? Do you think that that's
well, I don't hear a lot of psychiatrists, sort of making a call for that, but clearly, when the pandemic started, the first wave of trauma was really hitting the medical first responders, and obviously those people who got sick or their family members were sick. And yes, now we're having this whole second wave of trauma with the demonstrations. And also, I think it's important to acknowledge there has been ongoing racial trauma in this country for centuries. So it's high time that we talk about how traumatic it is to be a person of color in our country. So yes, there's a lot of people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. There's a lot of people who are traumatized. And right now, if you're not traumatized, you're not paying attention, like how could you not be traumatized by everything that's happening now? So, I guess a terrible joke I can make is like, my business is safe. Like there's going to be, no shortage of people who really need talented psychotherapists and psychopharmacologists and psychedelic therapists, and all sorts of support, and people who do integration work. There are going to be plenty of customers, unfortunately, because, everybody has been traumatized by the events of the past few months, and obviously some more than others, of course. But it's funny because, I was sort of joking that ever since Trump got elected, like my business has really been up, and yes, Trump's good for business. He's good for my business because the people that I treat have been really upset by what's going on, and really anxious and also despairing, in mourning for our country, for the environment, for women's rights, for the rights of people of color, like just so many things that are making people anxious and grieving and despairing. And if you look at United States, even before the pandemic, we had two big epidemics. One was the overdose epidemic, and the other was sort of an epidemic of loneliness. So those haven't gone away. There are still people dying of overdoses, and there are still people committing suicide, and all the diseases of despair, the deaths from alcoholism and from suicide and from overdose, those numbers are going up and up and up, and they will continue to go up and up. So the country's traumatized, and it's time for people who heal trauma or try to heal the effects of trauma to come forward and, volunteer their time and their open-heartedness and open-mindedness. And everybody should really think about openness and how if you're in fight or flight, you're closed, basically. It's a fearful state. Your amygdala, which is the fear center in the brain, is very active. And also there's this issue of sort of self-absorption, right? That when you're in fight or flight, it's kill or be killed, and it's all about you, and you're not necessarily trying to help your neighbor out at that point, So, but when you're in para, you are more open and less fearful and more likely to trust and to have altruism and cooperation and all these things that not only are good for society, they're good for you. They feel good. They're good psychologically and they're good physiologically. So, you do get something besides pleasure from altruism. You also put your body in a state where it can heal itself.
In the book, you talk about a reconciliation process supported by psychedelics between Palestinians and Israelis.
Yeah.
Israeli Jews. And I'm wondering if that offers a model for addressing the racial trauma and racism in our country.
Yeah. So this is actually looking at a group of people who are taking ayahuasca together from very different backgrounds. And there are also anecdotal reports of people taking MDMA together from these same communities. And I hope that will also be studied. Wherever you can find common ground to to start a conversation. I mean, you know, Sting, who I know is a fan of ayahuasca and other psychedelics, wrote a song years and years ago that was basically like, I hope the Russians love their children too. This idea that like, can we at least agree, you know, that we have love for children, and maybe that can be a basis for having a conversation about other things. So finding common ground, whatever it is, you know, you like the same music, you like the same drugs, you like the same clothing, whatever. I mean, if you know, I think what I said in the book is like, if you divide people up, you can always divide people up by their political beliefs, of course, but you could also divide people up by whether they want ketchup in their egg sandwich or not. And then all the people who think ketchup is disgusting can agree on that and maybe find a little common ground on a few other things also, you know? So, but the first step is to sort of mix it up, right? So you're not always in a bubble, agreeing with all the people who agree with you, which is obviously completely what happens with social media. You know, you curate your feed and then you feed on your feed and you don't open yourself to other ways of thinking about things.
Julie Holland, the new book is Good Chemistry.
That's what it is. I thought you were going to say is awesome. You were just trying to remember what it was called. I thought you were trying to find like just the right adjective.
No,
like, what did I say?
I just had the right senior moment. I just had that senior moment thing. I'm going to do it again. Just we can cut this or maybe not cut it. We'll see what happens. Julie Holland, the book is Good Chemistry. Get it now. Hot off the press.
Yes,
thank you so much.
Like June 16th. It was absolutely my pleasure to speak with you, Ken, and Lucid News. Congratulations and good luck on your new venture.
I appreciate
Which is
that.
Lucid News, which is what I'm saying.
This is where we are right now on Lucid News. Appreciate that and expect you to come back for more.
Perhaps in a while, if we're all still here, perhaps we can reconvene and have another talk.
Yeah,
we'll say, remember when we thought it was so bad in early June?
Oh my God. That is
I hope I'm wrong. I would love to be wrong.
Do you really think it's going to get worse?
I don't usually think things are going to get worse. I am usually pretty optimistic, but I think the watchword is just adaptability and openness and resilience. I think you have to be fluid. Things are changing very quickly. And if you spend a lot of time trying to gain ground and like what the rules were last week, you're going to miss what the new rules are for this week. So,
yeah.
There's a sort of thing in Buddhism where like, if you're walking in the sand and the water's getting higher and higher as you go into the water, at some point you can't be on the sand anymore. You have to either float or swim or you're going to drown. You have to stop gaining ground and stop seeking ground and just let it go. And I think that, we're pretty much in that phase now where, you have to have sort of an open hand as things come and things go and just try to be open and flexible.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's all about being able to handle the ambiguity and not being shook by the shifting parameters. And that's,
right. And so I think that people who have experience with psychedelics and are used to sort of perspective shifting and the rules shifting and having to go with the flow a little bit, I think you're at an advantage.
Absolutely. But I actually go one step further. And this is one reason why I'm so excited by the book, is that psychedelics in themselves don't do everything, right? That's where good therapy comes in. Right. That's where other practices, community practices, social norms, shifting social norms that support openness in your heart and in connection with others and prioritize it, make it a societal priority. That's what enables people to get through periods like this. And what's interesting is about this moment is that so many people are being triggered in a way that brings attention to exactly that issue at a time when the tools for addressing that issue are becoming more and more prominent, including your analysis in the book, but then also all the psychedelic medicines and all of the research into, essentially the para state through meditation and yoga and our understanding of how the brain works through that lens. And I mean, you make a link in the book, which I just haven't seen many people do before, which is almost like it's a societal biohacking move, right? Which is that our culture and our society benefit when we are optimized to be open.
Right.
Right? I mean, I haven't seen it. You didn't say, I was waiting for you to say that or something like that. You didn't quite do that.
But you did.
But I did it, but fuck it, I didn't write it.
Yeah.
But it's implied throughout your book. And you get close to it a couple of times but you don't actually make it a political frame. And what I'm noticing is the opportunity for a politics of healing effectively coming out of this insanity that we're going through. Where your approach is central to that kind of politics. And I'm kind of, we're like kind of kneading the dough here on Lucid News to see who's going to speak up around this and kind of give voice to that. And it's got to be more than just a generalist like me, because I don't have the cred. But there are people like you who really know the science, who can see the roots of what it means to activate in this way as a culture and as a society, and that to make essentially being in a state of para a social good that needs to be prioritized, because otherwise we're not going to be able to work through the issues we've got. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, I agree.
That's powerful territory, and I feel like it's now really emerging, and this moment is making people pay attention to that.
Yeah. So if nothing else, just giving it sort of a shorthand to just think about para, think about when you're in para, try to be open. You're going to be more open if you're in para. Just breathing through your nose will already help you get out of fight or flight.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I have lots of other tips in Good Chemistry for how to get into para and how to stay there.
Right. But as you sort of suggested before, our society actually prioritizes the fight or flight state. That's the social Darwinist place to be.
Well, it sort of gets into like this yin yang thing, where I think of yang, it's like you have a vector and you're moving and you're a projectile, and it's about capitalism and being an alpha,
right?
Go out there and get it. And yin is more that you are receiving, that you're open, that you're integrating. And the problem is that in our culture, we really prioritize yang and sort of demonize or repress yin. And
except now we have, there is more and more of an awareness of the importance of the divine feminine, which is the yin. And that is, me too. The whole, that is happening in a real way, right? Yeah. But again,
in some cultures and some sects of our society, we are getting more comfortable with yin and openness. But I would say that in other demographics, there's a real kind of circling the wagons around, and you could call it toxic masculinity, but it's a little bit of a throwaway. But it's just this cancer of yang, basically, which is what my partner Jeremy calls it.
I like it. That's actually good. Cancer of yang. But that's the Trump base. That's the emotional response that people have to him.
Yes.
That gives him the ability to do anything, and they all go, well, it doesn't matter what he does, because he's a guy's guy. He's a guy.
Right.
Right. And but that's getting smaller. That group is getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah. And all that yang is terrible for negotiations or tactful diplomacy or, any of the things that we've always relied on in the past.
Or frankly, solving complicated issues like environmental crisis.
Yeah. Or being open to information. One of the things that just kills me is, that Trump's like, I know all of this. I'm an expert on this because I had an uncle at MIT. And it's like, you're not an expert. Why don't you, take in information from experts? But you can't take in information if you are in this yang fight or flight, dominate or be submissive. It's all, there's a lot of sexual subtext actually to a lot of what Trump is, Trump wants the the governors to dominate the streets and things like that. I mean, it's, you know, this guy projects more than anybody I've ever seen, and everything he accuses other people of are his deepest fears about himself, that he is weak, that he's pathetic, that he's sad, you know,
and it
that he's a
resonates with his
loser. You know,
base.
it's so
It resonates
obvious,
with
you know,
the
as a
base. They're all,
psychiatrist.
yes, exactly. But it's the kind of thing that actually he's not the only person who's feeling this. So when he expresses this, it's a mirror for a lot of people who are going through something very similar, because our society is basically, I mean, bigger question, bigger thing, but the 60s was really about the forcing of the breaking open of the old masculine paradigms, challenging a lot of the old masculine paradigms. So like, oh, long hair, guys take purses out,
right?
You know, like all that, all those things, you know, that you can still see like on reruns of All in the Family, and and so it was a kind of a very aggressive way of challenging the old assumptions of masculinity. It's been 50 years, and now that's kind of
need to do it all over again.
Well, it went from being 20% of the population to 60% of the population, but those other 40% are holding on really hard because they're in a state of fight or flight. They're in the state of freedom about that topic. And Trump represents that in such a profoundly effective way, you know, because I don't even know if he knows what he's doing, but he's just channeling it. It's like crazy how he's able to hold that energetic space for a lot of people in this country.
And you know, there's this idea of identifying with the aggressor, where you would rather be a friend of the bullies than be bullied. And Trump actually does this with generals or with dictators. You know, guy's got like a hard on for dictators, right? I mean, he really likes them, but also his base identifies with the aggressor. They want to feel that power sort of secondarily. They want to feel powerful. A lot of people in the United States don't feel powerful, and they are disenfranchised and marginalized for all sorts of different reasons. But if they can tap into feeling like they're powerful, they're going to. So, and this is another reason why a lot of people buy guns. And, you know, one of the really scary things to me when I think about how divided the country is and who feels what and who's on what side, there may be more people on one side or the other. But there's one side that is more heavily armed than the other.
That's true.
No question. And that is really something to sort of factor into this calculus. And, you know, that is something, you know, as a physician, I care deeply about gun violence. So you know, it's a piece of the puzzle. And talk about yang, you know, projectile penetrative energy, you know, guns, missiles, rape, corporate malignant behavior, you know, it's all cancer of yang.
We can keep going. Next book. Oh, got to do some articles. Okay.
Well, a lot, you know, a lot of these ideas I work through with my partner Jeremy Wolf, and we talk a lot when we're in the woods or out in the lake, and sometimes I will, you know, send him my writing, and he will send back some ideas and things like that. But the cancer gang for sure is Jeremy's. You know, I would love him to write it because
he writes
I don't have to.
He writes really well.
But it does. I know he does write well, and he's written. You know, he wrote a chapter for the pop book. He wrote a chapter for this cannabis and spirituality book. And we talk about trying to write a book together, but it will either be like the best book ever, or it's going to break both of us. I don't know. But
listen,
but
no,
I think
you got to divide and conquer. You can say, okay, take that idea and write that one.
Right.
You know, you got to kind of you do it like a movie producer or something. You kind of say, like, oh, you take that section, I'll do this section.
Like if he wrote a chapter and I wrote a chapter, there would be no singular voice. I promise you. When you're reading it, it would be very clearly like this is my writing and this is his style of writing. But we'll see.
You do it as a bunch of individual pieces. It's collected essays. You don't make it a coherent book, right? And you have a couple of places in there where you guys have a dialogue, where you do a back and forth, kind of like Sylvain Lautringe and Paul Virilio in Pure War. You do a kind of, you know, two thinking individuals.
Right. Well, it is this idea of like, you know, seeing with two eyes from two different perspectives, and you've got a clearer picture. Like Jeremy and I will often approach things from completely different perspectives. And if we can stay in para to get each other's input and, you know, information, we end up with a better picture, both of us. But it's very challenging, you know, to stay in relationship and communicate and listen and really take in and integrate, you know, what people are offering you in dialogue. And most of us just sort of rehearse the part that we're going to say while they're talking, and then we say our thing. So, you know, I mean, I write in chapter 2 about how couples, how they can communicate. And it's mostly based on this kind of imago framework of that you mirror and you validate and you empathize so that people feel heard. And if you feel heard, you feel safe, you're in para, you can take in information.
Yeah.
So with the chanting, if it helps us feel unified and like we're doing something, I'm not sure how much information is necessarily expressed.
Well, so that's the thing I'm interested in seeing developed. Yeah, is what are the practices? What are the para practices for groups?
Right.
That's really interesting to me right now, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't see that being articulated very well. I mean, there are the nonviolent communication theories that people have been developing over many years, and those are powerful and valuable in very specific contexts, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the shamanic, you know, ceremony things that people can do. There's all sorts of, you know, we're going to pass the talking stick, you know, that happens a lot.
I think I wrote about like these restitution circles where there's a circle of people who bring in the perpetrator and the victim into a circle so that everything can be processed, not just the victim's experience, but why the perpetrator ended up, you know, perpetuating this crime, and, you know, how they were traumatized. And the whole circle comes to some agreement about what is restitution, what is appropriate restitution for the victim, and how can we address the trauma of the perpetrator. It's pie in the sky stuff, but it does happen in other cultures.
Yeah. Well, that's, I mean, on some level, you know, developing that kind of community, you know, practice, seeing that in action, and then seeing how essentially you start to scale the lessons of that. You scale the lessons of that, and you also scale the behavior around it. It becomes the premise of other forms of, you know, bigger society structures, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's where we're at. And I really feel like that's where we're at right now. It's like there's an openness to new forms, and that's, I mean, that's the conversation. I just did an interview with Paul Miller, DJ Spooky, that went up on the website. Yeah. And, you know, we start to, like, what is he interested in regarding the riots and all that? And he immediately jumps to, dude, we live in the 21st century and everything's digital. And these are bodies on the street acting as if it's 1848. You know what I'm saying? Where are the new forms?
Right.
How can we actually affect a digital capitalism that is, you know, moving way faster than we are? So it's like, okay, great, go on the street and express a lot of emotion, and it obviously is going to change some policy. That's a great thing. But maybe it might even help get somebody else other than Trump elected. God only knows. We'll see. But really, there's a vacuum here in terms of the ideological framework of what it is to make meaningful change in the 21st century. And the digital piece is going to be key in understanding, like, how not to have the country screwed by Facebook, right? Right. I mean, this is completely what we're living with, right? And then I think that another piece is what does it mean to be in para, right? What does that mean for an individual, and what does that mean for in a social context, right? Yeah. And then there's this, and psychedelics actually, amazingly, play into all of these approaches to you know, solving these problems. All right. Anyway, I am gonna have to run. Yes. And I'm sure you do too. But this is awesome. Love chatting with you as always.
Me too. Thanks for doing this and recording it. And I hope your recording comes out okay.
I think it's gonna be fine. I think this is Zoom. I trust Zoom.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? Okay. Ciao. You take it easy.
All
Say hi
right.
to Jeremy.
If I can, I will. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Ciao.
Bye.